everybody being here this afternoon. I have permission from David. I was talking to David about the context in which the scriptures fall that he read, how I was going to cover them, and told him, man, it's just going to be hard for me to preach this because it'd take 2-3 hours to get through all the history to set the context for this. And he said, well, I don't mind. And I thought, all right. They don't agree with you, David. I love you, man, but no. This is one of those, I'm going to try to make this one of those age-appropriate things. I mean, no offense to anyone, but as I get older, and I begin to realize that what we do in our older age matters just as much, I think even as much or more than what it did when we were younger, because we, hubris of youth and such, we make our mistakes when we're young. But when we get older, we can't use that excuse. It's like, no, we should know better. We should be doing the right thing. And sometimes it's just terribly disappointed when we, as older people, get caught up in all of the distractions that cause us to be not who we should be. And we don't act as we should, as the mature Christians that we ought to be. And this is a microcosm of that issue. There's an event that occurs here. It's just a couple of verses here in this chapter. But in order to get the chapter, you got to get the context. And so I'm going to rattle on about a context here for just a few minutes before I get to the actual point, which will probably take 2 minutes. But I've got to get me 20 minutes out of this. So here we go. But any time in the Middle Eastern cultures in that day and age back during the kings, it was a matter of when you took over as king, you kind of cleaned up shop. Well, we have the same kind of thing that goes on in our politics today. I mean, when somebody moves in as president and takes over as president in our country, all of the alphabet agencies all get restructured, right? The DOJ, the ATF, the FBI, NAS, and all the rest of them. The president puts in men in positions of power that he can rely on or trust, or so he thinks, and so he puts them in those kinds of agencies to do it. It's not that much different when a king takes over, even if a good king is taking over from a good king. And that's what we have here in 1 Kings. In 1 Kings, David is old as 1 Kings begins. He's old and he's about to die. In fact, he was so old, he needed a constant nurse, which is basically what the concubine was that he was given. Abishag was given to him in chapter 1, verse 4. Is one young woman, very lovely. She cared for the king and served him, but the king did not know her. It was basically his wife, but not really his wife. It was his wife, legitimate legally, but he was an older man and he just needed a nurse around. And so therefore, that's the kind of circumstance that David was in as he was beginning to grow old. Now, of course, what happens in the kingdom is Adonijah, one of his sons. By the way, Adonijah's Absalom's brother. He must have been very much like Absalom, very good-looking guy, very winsome, a public figure kind of guy, and so it wasn't hard for him to gather his little following. And he did so, and some of his following included the main general of the army, Joab, and it included also the main priest, Abiathar. And he got a bunch of guys on his side, and he decided, well, Dad's getting old. It's time for me to declare myself as king. I'm, the progenitor. I'm the guy who's the oldest of the boys, and so I should be getting the king. And so he goes out to a particular place. We could talk for ages about all the details, but he goes out and has himself crowned king. Well, he very conspicuously did not invite Nathan the prophet. He did not invite the other guy that was a high priest, Zadok. He didn't invite Solomon, wonder why, his own brother. All the other brothers evidently showed up, except Solomon. This was not one of those little accidental things where he was just doing his thing and it was all copacetic. No, this was an intentional political move to take over the kingdom. Adonijah was very much like his brother Absalom, had no patience and thought he was deserving, and being the enablement child he was, he decided he'd just take over. Well, as it turns out, Bathsheba sees this coming and goes in to her husband and says, you promised me my boy would be running the country. And so David said, okay, let's set this up, and discovers and finds out that Adonijah's declared himself king. And I guess, too, probably to his disappointment, Abiathar, a high priest that he loved, and they went through some hard times together. He had kind of jumped ship, and as well as Joab. Of course, you kind of expect that from Joab. Joab was kind of opportunist. He killed two generals, Amasa and I forgot the other guy's name, but he killed two generals. That bugs me. I'm going to find his name right quick.
Abner.
Thank you, Abner. Abner and Amasa were both, kings of Judah, king of Israel, and they were great guys. And Joab was a sneaky little booger, and he killed both of them on the sly. So he wasn't really above board, and yet Joab was a very powerful, mighty man, and he jumped ship to go with Adonijah. Well, they gathered up Nathan, and they gathered up Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. Benaiah was a great general, a great warring man, and he was going to end up being the new general in Joab's place. And he gave and conferred from David the king to Solomon the kingship. Well, everybody in the city was great about that, and all of a sudden you got Solomon as king now, and Adonijah and the rest of his crew are very fearful about things. And so as things progress, when Solomon takes over, he's going to, and I love the phrase they use in the Old Testament, he's going to establish his kingdom. That's code for, I'm killing out anybody that's in opposition to me. Now that happened a lot, okay? Solomon was not the exception to the rule, that was the rule. If you were controversial, if you were against the soon-to-be king, when he got to be king, you were in trouble. And so Adonijah, his own brother, knew that, okay, it's going to be bad for me. So he ran into the temple, grabbed the horns of the altar, and said, I'm not coming out until Solomon swears he won't kill me. And I love the way that Solomon put it in chapter 1, verse 52. Solomon said, if he proves himself a worthy man, and not one hair of his head shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Now, what's the odds? Here's the guy that just tried to take over from his daddy, unauthorized, unscripted. I mean, he just tried to do a coup is what it was. And so, yeah, if any wickedness is found in him, we probably know what's going to happen in chapter 2 with Adonijah. And sure enough, Adonijah makes a fool move, and even with a ploy with Bathsheba, gets her to approach Solomon to have Abishag, David's wife, after David had passed. Well, not only is that totally illicit according to Moses' law, but it was also a plague. You remember when Absalom took over and ran David out of the city? Absalom took over, and the one thing he did was the 10 wives that David left in the house to keep house while he was gone and running, he took them up on the top of the house, and by the way, the top of the house had parapets around it, and it was a flat roof, and he took them up there, put him up a tent, and he violated every one of those women in front of everybody, because that's what kings did back then. They took the harem of the previous king, and they had sex with all of them, and that way he showed his dominance. Kind of animalistic, don't you think? But that's kind of the way people were back then. And so Adonijah was asking basically for that right. And that was it. Solomon said, no, it's over, and he had Adonijah offed immediately. And then, of course, there was Shimei. Shimei is the guy that kicked dirt in David's face, and David was not happy about it. And later on in the back of the chapter, in beginning in verse 36, Shimei was told, you dissed my dad. Solomon was telling him, you disrespected my dad, and we're going to let you live, but here's how you're going to live. You're going to live in Jerusalem. You leave Jerusalem, you're dead meat. That's the way of it. And so therefore, everything was copacetic for a few years, and all of a sudden, a couple of Shimei's slaves took off, and without thinking, or maybe with thinking, and figured he could get away with it. I don't know why people do things wrong when they know better, but whatever went through his mind, he took off, went and got his slaves, and came back. Well, don't you know, the story got out. It's kind of like my dad and mom in school. They knew what I did wrong in school before I got home. So I knew when I got home that I was going to get a whooping for what I did wrong at school, because they already knew. Half the town knew in the prior. But nevertheless, they knew. And so Solomon went to Shimei and said, where you been? What'd you do? If you went out of town, what's the rule? You die. Shimei died. Solomon was cleaning things up. And when you look at guys like Joab, right before that, in the text from verse 28 down through 35, Joab knew he was not an up-and-up kind of guy. He knew he had killed two generals on the sly. In fact, he had what is called in the Bible, he had acted like he was at war when they were at peace. Which tells you something, and I'm not going to chase this rabbit, but there's a difference between going to war and killing because you're a soldier. Wish Boyce was here to support him and what he has done for this country. and many of you who are veterans, like Pete there, going in and doing your due for your country. It's a different thing when you're at war, protecting your country, and then just deciding off the scales, well, I just don't like this guy, so I'm going to shoot him. Those are not the same thing. And this guy, Joab, the general, should have known better. And here is Solomon cleaning up all of these guys, but there is one exception in the bunch, and we see this, and there's all kinds of speculation. I'll share with some of it with you. That Abiathar was a good guy. Abiathar's daddy had been priest, and Saul came in and killed 70-something guys, all in one fell swoop. And Abiathar got away. Abiathar fled to David. This was when David was running from Saul. Saul was trying to kill him because he knew David was a good man and he was jealous of him. But Abiathar was with David. He was running. And the things that David went through, Abiathar had to go through. And Abiathar really had been through it with David, a companion in arms, as it were. And he's different from the others that we're reading about. He did not grievously offend God like Adonijah. He did not offend the law of God like Joab. He did not offend God's anointed king like Shimei did. Abiathar was not in that bunch. And what's hard to figure is here in his age, because actually Zadok and Abiathar were priests both at the same time, and Abiathar was older. He was from Eleazar, a senior line of Aaron's sons. I looked it up. I've forgotten the name of the other priest with Eleazar, but one of Aaron's sons. Zadok was of that line. He was a junior priest of the two. As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting when you look back at the mention of those two priests. Every time they're mentioned, Zadok is given the higher rank. Not only is he younger, he's from a younger lineage. And yet in the text of the Bible, by inspiration, Zadok is always placed above. That has led many scholars to think maybe Abiathar was worried about his position. When Adonijah decided, I'm going to take over as king, Abiathar saw his place. Okay, I can be on Adonijah's side, and I can be the chief priest now, and I don't have to worry about Zadok. Who knows what the reason was, but here's what we know. Abiathar picked the wrong guy to follow. He should not have followed Adonijah. Abiathar had gone through it with David. He was a war buddy with David. They were together. They went through all kinds of things together. And why it is, at the last minute, when God's chosen, which all of them admitted, even Adonijah admitted, his brother Solomon was the one that the Lord wanted to be king. Okay? When he was approaching Bathsheba, said, yeah, all the people wanted me to be king. And I'm the oldest, I should be king. But, it was in the Lord's will that Solomon be king. He had to concede. He just was not a nice person, Adonijah. But Abiathar knew better. Why was it in his age, in his wisdom, that he would choose to go with Adonijah instead of waiting and hearing his compadre, his companion, David the king, make the decision to choose the person who would be king and then take his role? Some really think that because his role at the time was behind Zadok, that there was a bit of jealousy. I don't know, it could have been. But I know this, he chose poorly, and because he is the exception in this section of guys, it says that when Solomon approaches him, the king said, go to Anathoth, to your own fields, you go home, you're retired now. That's called a forced retirement in our vernacular. Okay? You're retired now, but notice what he says. You are deserving of death. See, Adonijah was killed. Shimei was killed. Joab was killed. And he was telling him, as a head priest, and you were in this conflict over here with this other guy that you should have been with, you deserve death. This shows the wisdom of Solomon showing up really early in his career. But I will not put you to death at this time, and here's why. But I will not put you to death this time because you carried the ark of the Lord before my father David. That's when they brought it back from Obed-Edom's place and brought it into Jerusalem. Okay, you carried the ark. And because you were afflicted every time my father was afflicted. Because of your past, there's going to be a leniency given to you that was not given to these other guys. Because Joab fought beside David. Okay, Shimei was way on the outs. But, when it comes to it, Adonijah was his own brother. yet here we find the exception to the rule, and Solomon removed Abiathar from being high priest to the Lord, that he might fulfill the word of the Lord. By the way, this is the other little twist in this thing. Remember back long years ago, before the kings, when Samuel, as a small child, was given to priest Eli, and Phinehas and Hophni were sorry, ragged priests that were good for nothing. And God told Eli, it's because you wouldn't put your thumb down on these two boys that the kingdom is going south and things are going wrong. They lost the Ark of the Covenant. The Philistines took off with it in a battle that they lost terribly. And people just a bunch of them died, and it was horrible. It was a terrible time in their life. And Eli, when he heard that both his sons had died in the battle, fell over backwards. He was a heavy guy. Fell over backwards, broke his neck, died. That was a hard time for Israel. One of the promises that was made to Eli is, you know what?